Today we're going to be talking about love, and it's pretty interesting. I remember a story that I heard of a girl who broke off an engagement with a young man by the name of Tommy, and she felt terrible about that. So she wrote him a letter. Quote, "Dearest Tommy, no words could ever express the great unhappiness I've felt since breaking our engagement. Please say you'll take me back. No one could ever take your place in my heart, so please forgive me. I love you. I love you. I love you," with an exclamation point. One final, "I love you. Yours forever, Marie. P.S. Congratulations on winning the state lottery." Now you think about that. She uses that word 4 times, and I don't think it means what she thinks it means. It is true that the concept of love in our culture has become over-sexualized, over-dramatized, and even over-universalized. And while it's being overused in all these cases, I would tell you today it has truly become underutilized. Last week, Lyndon spoke, and he spoke from James chapter 2 about the royal law and how that is attached to the concept of loving your neighbor. Loving God is the most important. Loving neighbor is second to it. And Jesus today teaches a master class on what it means to love, the depths of love, the differentiation of Christian love when he says, love your enemies. Today, we are going to know what it means to be children of the Most High. So turn with me to the book of Luke. Luke chapter 6 is where we're at. We started, for visitors, I want to welcome you. My name is Nathan Keller. I'm the minister here. I think I've introduced myself to everyone here. But we started last December. I don't know if the church knows this. We started last December in the book of Luke. And we have been covering every verse since then, almost every time that I speak, with the exception for like Easter, things like that. And we find ourselves now in October 22nd, in Luke chapter 6. I have done this before with the book of John, and it is something that's very enlightening to the church when you go verse by verse, and to myself. It allows the Bible and God's inspiration to determine what you're going to talk about, not what you feel like you want to talk about. And I think that's very important for us as preachers. So let me go ahead and set the context for you here in Luke chapter 6. Jesus has already appointed his apostles, and he goes down and heals a lot of people on this large plateau, and he looks up to them and he tells them the Beatitudes. He's got 4. The last Beatitude we covered 2 weeks ago was the one where he said, "Blessed are you," verse 22, "when people hate you, when they exclude you, when they insult you and reject your name as evil because of me, the Son of Man." And then he says, "Woe to you if they talk nice about you," because that's what they did for the false prophets. That's the opposite woe there. And then all of a sudden, Jesus expands on this hatred that people have for people who are in him. And what's his response? To love them. We find ourselves in Luke chapter 6, verse 27. Jesse, thank you for reading that. I'm not going to reread it, but you might follow along. I believe it's important to paraphrase. Jesus speaks to all these people and he says, "Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, and bless those who curse you, and pray for those who are mean to you. If they slap you on the cheek, turn to them the other. If they take your coat, you give them your shirt. And if someone asks for something or takes it and you give it, do not ask for it to be returned." Verse 31, he gives us the golden rule. Do to others as you would have them do to you. Verse 32, what use is it? What use is it if you love someone who loves you? What use is it if you do good to someone who does good to you? Or what use is it to lend to someone you know will pay you back? Because all sinners do that as well. The entire world does that as well. You're supposed to be different. Love your enemies. Be good to them. Lend to them. Expect nothing in return. Then you will be greatly rewarded, and you will be children of the Most High. Be merciful as your Father is merciful. Wow. What does this mean? Is Jesus giving us some type of policy to use as a government? No. That would probably be an unwise thing for any government to follow this policy when you're talking about foreign policy. However, Jesus is talking about the individuals that are in his group, people who follow him, that they should be different than the world. If I was to tell you what he's trying to tell them in the text here, he says, love your enemies as God has loved you. In other words, love your enemies, and in that last part, be merciful as God is merciful. He's been merciful with you. So you love your enemies as God has loved you. Now that's a very controversial topic. Think about who he's talking to. He's talking to people who have been or are being taxed into oblivion. He's talking to people who have Rome, who is occupying their country, these people of the promise. And these people, these Romans, could physically abuse them. They can enslave them with not much of an argument. And then you have on top of that people like Simon the Zealot, other zealots who may not quite be like Simon, who are waiting in dark corners, waiting for an opportunity to take power back. And here's Jesus, standing in the midst of them, and he says, love your enemies, do good to them. It's as if Jesus knows there's coming a time in which these Jews are going to have to love like they have never loved before. And with this command of love your enemies, we need to understand that it's telling us that there is not a single person who draws breath that as a creation of God, you should not love. Every person should be the object of God's love, and therefore the object of the love of his people. We like to make excuses sometimes. I don't like the way they dress. I don't like what they put on their skin. I don't like what they put in their face. I don't like how they wear their hair. I don't like who they love. I don't like who they vote for. Sometimes we allow sin to be that barrier. We say, they're not good enough to love. And we act as if that creates a barrier so they don't need to be loved. And we forget the sin we have is the exact reason why God loves us. Not because he loves our sin, but because he understands we're broken. And the only way to reconcile his people is if he loves us. For you today, our lesson is this: God's children must learn to love like him. Because if you don't, if you just love like everyone else, then the world's going to see you. Are they going to say, what's different about so-and-so? Are they going to ask why you're different? And therefore, could you tell me about this Jesus? Not at all. You have to be different. John says, anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. If there's someone who has a kind of sin and we use that as a reason for not loving them, we have to realize God loves you. Even though you have sinned, even though you do sin, even though you will sin. And so we as Christians must love like the Father, which means loving our enemies. You with me? We have to love our enemies. Now, when we think about love, of course, the word agape is used here. I think most people in here know this. This is Strong's definition for agape. To welcome, to entertain, to be fond of, to love dearly. Think about that for a moment. As if you're at your house. Would you welcome an enemy into your house? Whew. To entertain, another action word. Would you entertain them? That is, actually interact with them. and have some interesting conversation. Maybe even give them peace and give them joy. To be fond of something overarching over the way you do things, but do we have a fondness for our enemies, recognizing that they are in fact images of God? Do we love dearly and deeply? I think Jesus says to do these things when he says, do good, bless, and pray for your enemies. You know, Lyndon a couple weeks ago said us preachers like to stand up and act as if we know what we're talking about. I think it's important for us to do our research and be able to stand up here and know what we might be saying and be prepared. But there are things I could never really teach you in regards to love that can only be trained through example, honestly. And I think Eleanor Roosevelt says it best when she says the giving of love is an education in itself. Once you start doing it and try doing it, you're going to learn more about what it takes and the depth of it. We've already learned that the Jews, they had enemies, right? Jesus' audience had enemies. And I'm going to go out on a limb right now for you. I think you have an enemy. I think every person in here has an enemy, and you may be able to give that person a name. You may have a face for that person and not know their name. You may have a group of people, and you may know a sect of people, but you have someone who you think of as an enemy today. I do. And Jesus Christ, when he talks about enemies in the Beatitudes, he talks about the people who hate, who separate, who say mean things and misrepresent you. He says that happens because of him and because of our belief in him. And what should we do? We're supposed to love our enemies. I'm reminded of Martin Luther King. He gave this sermon at I think it's called Dexter First Baptist Church. And as he's talking about all the reasons that people might not like you. In fact, that people might hate you. People might hate you because you're talented in something. They may hate you because you're good at something or because you know someone. On the flip side, they may hate you because they don't think you're pretty at all. They may hate you because you aren't as talented as they are. They may hate you because you don't know the people. And he goes on to talk about the fact that they may hate you because of the texture of your hair, the skin color that you have. They may hate you for things like who you vote for. They may hate you for who you spend time being with. They may hate you because of who you worship. That's why we see the conflict happening right now, don't we? The bombing of Israel, and Israel going back in and invading Gaza and bombing them. Isn't that why we see that? People are having this, some people feel like they're defending themselves, but they also look at each other and they see enemies across the border. And as Christians, Christ, he died for us. And he said, love your enemies. He said, do good to those who hate you. I want you to think about that for a moment. Do good. That takes something off the table that as a kid I hated. I did not like this. When I first moved to Muleshoe High School, you know, we all like to be slightly different. I had this little whew to my hair, like it's similar to what I have now. And I had a certain style of clothing and everything. And all of a sudden, this kid walks in. He's got my same hairdo. It's even going the right way. I mean, the same way. And he and I look very similar, and we are both same height. The only difference is the name. And I remember when we were in athletics, all the boys are lined up. The coaches can see who's the fastest. And he and I happen to be standing next to each other. And when the coach says go, we start running as fast as we can. And we start to beat everybody. And then we're going. And guess what? He beats me by about 8 feet. I measured. And for some reason, from that moment on, he and I did not gel. It was very easy for me, whenever he would walk in the room and start talking with his friends, I would turn the other way and go and be in my area and talk with my friends. We would separate. I can count on one hand how many times we actually spoke to each other. For some reason in our youth, at least in my mind, he was an enemy, and he did make fun of me one time that I can remember, and that made an impact. I want you to think about this. When Jesus says do good, he takes something off the table, your ability to not do anything. When there's someone who considers themselves their enemy, or you think of them as your enemy, it is not an option as a Christian to just pretend they don't exist, go to another room, have nothing to do with them. Jesus says do good. That's an action. And so what we're supposed to do, I think back about that. I wish I would have been better. I wish I would have changed things. Martin Luther King tells a story there in Dexter about Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln's running for president, and this other guy he's running against is making fun of him. He's making fun of how tall he is, how lanky he is. He's making fun of his face, his beard, how he's talking slow. He makes fun of how dim and not smart he sounds. He wins the election. Abraham Lincoln does. And he's sitting there. He's got all of his advisors. They're talking about the cabinet. And the question comes up, who's going to be the Secretary of War? And he looks across all of them and he says, Edwin Stanton. Their jaws hit the floor. What? Don't you know Edwin Stanton made fun of you? He told people you were stupid. He didn't like the way you spoke. He's your enemy. And he said, yeah, I know, but he's the best man for the job. Interesting that while Edwin Stanton and all the advisors of Abraham Lincoln allowed themselves to be blinded by this enemy concept, that Abraham Lincoln, he decided to show an act of love, to throw him a bone, to do good. I've got a question for you. Do you think Edwin Stanton deserved it? Jesus says, love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Modern Christians, I think, do not understand that word bless. I think we overuse that word. Oh, bless you, bless you. The word bless and the word prayer are not exactly the same, though you can sometimes use them in the same context. The word bless is different, though, in that it can be simply to encourage someone and to lift them up. The same character I told you about, the boy who looked just like me, I'll tell you another story about him. I was in acting class there in junior high, and I got the lead. Yeah, I was not a good actor. It just happened to be there was not very many boys, I'll just tell you. I was excited because it was like a Romeo and Juliet kind of comedy, which means I was going to share my first kiss with a girl, right? I was really nervous about that. It was going to be on stage. We never practiced it or anything. It was just going to be the day of. So, you know what happens? The worst thing happens possible. My grandpa dies. The funeral's the same day as UIL competition. So I go tell the teacher, and she says, okay, we're going to give it to your understudy. Guess who that is? And he did a good job, by the way. He did a great job. I never told him. You see, I continued to do that thing where he'd walk in the room, I'd stay far away, I didn't talk with him. And what Jesus says, he says, bless those who curse you, even if they are talking about you behind your back or gossiping or anything, or calling down curses upon you, literally, as that text says. Jesus says, my people are supposed to bless others, to go and encourage them, even if they curse you, to bless them. I should have gone up to him and said, you did a good job. And I still wonder to this day, how might our relationship have been different had I done that? Wow. Question. Let's say he did make fun of me all the time and he did gossip about me. Did he deserve me coming and blessing him? Jesus says, love your enemies. Pray for those who mistreat you. And this is possibly the most difficult one. And the reason it's probably the most difficult is because if you believe in God and you believe He listens to your prayers and you believe He not only listens, but He actually acts upon your prayers and your requests on your faith, then what you realize is that when you pray for someone you don't like, that means somehow God's going to work for their good. And so you take the time in your own private life to set aside time to pray for someone who actively mistreats you. There's no cameras. You can walk up to anybody and just have a smile on your face, say, here, borrow some sugar. Oh, your granddaughter did great. But to set aside time to go into your house all by yourself and pray to the Lord of heaven and earth on behalf of someone you think hates you, there's some sacrifice. And they should be at the top of our list. Do you think they would deserve it? Jonah didn't think the people of Nineveh deserved anything. Question. Do you deserve it? Did Jesus not love His enemies? In fact, when He's put on the cross, all of mankind's sins are placed upon Him. That includes you and I. Our sins are placed upon Jesus. Paul says God demonstrates His own love for us in this, that while we were still sinners, enemies of Christ, He died for us. Loving like Jesus means loving your enemies. And that, I tell you what, that's different, isn't it? It's not like the world. It's a stronger kind of love, because if somebody comes up and slaps you, you're supposed to turn the cheek. Or if somebody takes your stuff, you're not supposed to ask for it back. Listen to this. It is different than the love that the world shows. C.S. Lewis and many other people talk about the different kinds of Greek words for love. I've talked about agape, eros, a physical kind of love built on sexuality and what you see in somebody. Storge, that is family. Phileo, that is friendship. You have these different kinds of loves, and they're all based on what? Feelings. You're not going to be friends much longer if you don't feel like friends, right? If your marriage is based on nothing else than eros and the feeling of that's not going to last very long, because you need to build up other attachments, other kinds of feelings, and also something better. This is different kind of love. God's love requires a kind of fortitude that bodybuilders dream of, academics fail to understand, and also psychologists, they cannot truly explain. C.S. Lewis says it this way: though our feelings come and go, God's love for us does not. Thank you very much, God. Both Paul and John testify to this and the sacrificial nature it is to its very core. How can it not be? Someone smacks you, you turn the cheek. You're literally taking your own ego, who you are and the justice you think you should have, and you're putting those things on the altar, and you're not really doing it for your own physical safety. You're doing it for the good of a person who hates you. Sound familiar? Absolutely. Do to others as you would have them do to you. It's a different kind of love. It contrasts with the whole rest of the world if you love like this. If you think about the world for a moment, and you think about all the different religions, I really do think that many of them, most of them, if not all of them, are supposed to affect the world in some good way. I think that they're supposed to call you to faith or righteousness or even peace or unity. But if you look at some of them, if you read it the wrong way, it can affect the way you respond. I think of religions like Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, even indigenous faiths that call people to unity through nature. That's kind of good, but they're all missing something, church. They're all missing something. You know what? They're missing the pearl of great price. They're missing the treasure that's in a field. They're missing a father who's merciful. So merciful that he gave his one and only son to die for you. A father who loves you so much that he wanted to give you a clear conscience, a place in heaven. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. Love your enemies. When you look at that reading, there's something that Jesus says that's, I think a lot of people wonder about that, and it is this: you're going to be greatly rewarded? What does that even mean? How are you rewarded? The people who are listening to Jesus, they didn't know about our baptism. They didn't know about our call to faith, sanctification, justification, those kinds of things. What does he mean? I want everybody to imagine something with me for a moment. Even if you aren't, I think you can learn something from this. And if you're a kid, this is even better. You ready? You're a parent. That's right. Good luck. You're a parent and you have a child and you sacrifice all the things you love to do with your time to make money so that kid can eat, have a roof, and have a good education. And then the more time you give to them, the more they take it for granted. Oh, they take. But you love them. And one day they move out of your house. And they got to do things on their own. And you get a call from the police station. Not only did they drop out of school, but they got in trouble with the law. And you go and talk to them. And they tell you 3 of the words that you, as a parent, never want to hear. I hate you. I never want to see you again. Get out of my life forever. And so, years go by. You don't hear anything from that kid. 7 years later, there's a knock on your door. And there they stand. They introduce their wife and their 2 children and ask if they can come talk to you, if they can step inside. Absolutely. You sit down, you're on pins and needles. What's going on? You're a little nervous too because you remember the last conversation. And they say, I'm sorry. I should have listened to you. I messed up so bad. But I want to say thank you because of what you told me throughout my life, how you raised me. I kept hearing your voice. It kept me from going off the edge. Thank you. It's like the prodigal son, isn't it? That's a good story, right? What has happened in that story? You sacrificed yourself for someone you love. And you do that today. It might be a child. It could be someone who you work with or even a spouse or people in a church. Not every relationship in the church goes as it's supposed to. Sometimes you are hated and you continue to sacrifice yourself for that person. And sometimes one day they wake up from their blindness. And I want to tell you, it's one of the greatest rewards in the world when a sacrifice pays off and someone's life is changed completely the angels celebrate. I think that is a great reward indeed. But you need to be aware. Years ago, I stood in the room in a therapy center with George Gray, a minister of 50 years, and I asked him, please give me some advice as a preacher. What do I do? Like, what's your best advice? He said, love people and know they will break your heart. But the command is the same. Love people. When you love people, especially your enemies, I guarantee your heart's going to get broken more than not. And it makes us scared. We clam up and we say, you know what? If somebody's going to treat me like this, why would I ever act good to them? Why would I ever bless them? Why would I ever pray for them? Every man for themselves. C.S. Lewis talks about the alternative. He talks about holding your broken heart and cradling it. He says, wrapping it carefully round with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. The only place outside heaven where you can perfectly have your heart safe from all the dangers of love is hell. I want you to think about that for a moment. We need to understand that when we see bombs being lobbed, when we see somebody in an interview who is devoid of all understanding of righteous justice, when you come into contact or into the focus of a bully, or when the world seems to be throwing way more enemies at you than allies, you need to remember something. As God's child, you are commissioned to love all people, even enemies. Loving like that looks different. It looks like Nadine Collier, who was a mother, whose mother, Ethel, was one of the 9 victims in the 2015 mass shooting at Charleston, South Carolina, at a church. She stood in the courtroom to address her mother's killer. Choking back tears, she said, "You took something very precious away from me. I'll never get to talk to my mother again. But I forgive you. I forgive you. If God forgives you, I forgive you." God looks, His love looks like loving people even when it potentially can put us into harm. And how do we know this? We look at the greatest story ever told. On a Friday 2,000 years ago, our Messiah was mocked, He was beaten, He was whipped, He was nailed to a cross, and when His voice, when his lungs were losing breath and He was losing energy, He dedicated His last few breaths to say, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Loving like that changes the world. Did you know that? Think about where you are right now, where you're sitting right now. Would you be sitting here had Christ not rose from the grave? Would the faith that your parents have taught you, would it have been something to teach you and change your life had Christ not risen from the grave? Oh my goodness. There's no better testimony than that to tell you that loving like God, loving your enemies, truly does in fact change the world. And that's the decision Christians are coming up against. Do we love people or do we hit back? You hit back, you don't change anything. You make it worse. From hate comes more hate, and more hate, and more hate. But when you love like Jesus, you change people's lives.